David Greenwood was successful and respected, until his son exposed the secrets of his schemes. Soon, the money was only the tip of the iceberg, hiding old wounds, family conflicts, and the collapse of trust. Now, David stands on the verge of losing everything: his family, reputation, and sense of purpose. The upcoming events will astonish even those who have seen it all. But let's start from the beginning. Millionaire David Greenwood had spent his entire life carefully crafting the image of a man who had risen from the bottom and achieved everything on his own. Every step he took, every public appearance or business deal reinforced this perfect persona. His success story sounded as if it had been cut from a textbook on entrepreneurship. In the eyes of the public, he was a hero, a man who started from nothing and built an empire through hard work and unbreakable willpower. His wife, Caroline, and children, Michael and Sarah, never doubted the truth of his stories. To them, David wasn't just a father and husband, but a symbol of success and integrity. They took pride in their luxurious lifestyle: the massive house, expensive cars, elite schools for the children, and regular trips to exotic destinations. David always seemed attentive to his family, supporting them and creating a sense of complete security. However, no one, not even his closest loved ones, knew that this world was built on a foundation of lies and secrets. In reality, David's path to wealth was far from an honest one. His first business had failed, followed by risky investments and bad deals. To save his position, he started working with shady businessmen, hiding his income through offshore accounts and manipulating financial reports to create an illusion of prosperity. And though his business gradually grew, the foundation of this growth was shaky, like sand. Every new project, every new contract was a risky game he played on the edge of legality. But all this time, David reassured himself that no matter how far he went, he could always wriggle his way out. He believed in his luck and that he could stop when the situation became critical. However, when the global economy started to falter and his company suddenly found itself on the brink of bankruptcy, his house of cards began to collapse. David faced the threat of losing everything. With each passing day, the pressure mounted. His projects began to crumble one after another, and investors to whom he had promised massive returns started sending demands for immediate repayment. He knew that if he didn't find a solution quickly, disaster would be inevitable. However, David couldn't bring himself to confess this to his family. His wife and children saw him as a model of success and honesty. To them, he was a man who always had everything under control. One evening, sitting in his luxurious office overlooking the city, David realized his time was running out. He sat in front of his computer, reviewing the financial reports he had been falsifying for months. On the surface, everything looked perfect, but behind those numbers lurked a massive financial hole that grew larger by the day. David no longer knew where the lies ended and reality began. He started taking massive loans from private investors, promising them incredible returns. The falsified documents created by his team of accountants were supposed to convince everyone that his business was stable and still generating profit. But this was just a shiny cover for his financial disaster. The more he lied, the more entangled he became in this web. Every night, David couldn't sleep, his thoughts restlessly bouncing between the fear of exposure and the desperate hope for a miracle. He knew that if the truth came to light, it would not only destroy his reputation, but also the lives of his entire family. His wife Caroline, his children who took pride in their father, they would lose everything, realizing their life had been built on deceit. Yet, despite all the fears and internal conflict, he couldn't stop. To retreat would mean admitting defeat, and David Greenwood never accepted defeat. He hoped he could pull off one last deal that would save his business and restore order. But the deeper he sank into this pit of lies and manipulation, the more obvious it became that he had little time left. Every day had become a survival game. Amid his financial schemes, David began to notice strange changes in his children's behavior. He was particularly troubled by his eldest son, Michael, who had previously shown little interest in the family business. Michael had always been absorbed in his own projects, living a relatively independent life, even though he had the opportunity to work for his father's company. However, lately, he had suddenly begun taking an interest in the business, visiting the office more often and asking questions about the company's operations, topics he had never mentioned before. David didn't immediately think much of it. He was pleased that his son was finally showing interest in the family business, especially at a time when the company needed stability and support. However, the more Michael delved into the company's affairs, the more uneasy David became. Michael was asking too many questions about the financial reports, about major deals, and about contracts David would rather keep hidden from prying eyes. His persistent interest started to seem suspicious. Meanwhile, David's wife, Caroline, had begun insisting on greater transparency in the business. Normally, she had never interfered in the company's affairs, trusting her husband to manage the finances and make all the important decisions. But now, she was increasingly talking about the need for an external audit and that the company should be more open about its financials. Her conversations about employees being worried about the future of the company and that she had heard rumors about possible problems caused David deep anxiety. David couldn't shake the feeling that someone in his circle was hiding something from him. He began to suspect that Michael and Caroline might be discussing something behind his back. The more questions they asked, the more his fear of exposure grew. He tried to maintain composure, smiling and reassuring them that everything was under control. But inside, the tension was building. For his part, Michael also sensed that something was off with his father. His initial suspicions arose when he noticed strange discrepancies in documents he had accidentally come across. Financial reports that should have been transparent contained numerous corrections and suspicious transactions. At first, Michael thought it was just a mistake, but when he dug deeper, he realized that these mistakes were systematic. Every new document only deepened his suspicions. Michael was shocked to discover that his father, who had spent his life teaching him about honesty and fairness, could be involved in something so dirty. He recalled how David had always emphasized the importance of conducting business ethically, how he had never used illegal schemes to achieve success. Now, a completely different picture was unfolding before Michael. Yet, despite all the uncovered facts, Michael wasn't quick to jump to conclusions. He knew that accusations against his father could destroy the entire family. Michael decided not to say anything to anyone until he had fully figured things out. He continued his secret investigation, carefully examining every new document that came his way. He began spending more time in the office, observing the flow of finances and discreetly double-checking each report. Michael knew that if his suspicions were confirmed, he would face a difficult decision. However, time was working against him. David was becoming more and more anxious, and Michael could feel the situation escalating each day. His father could notice his investigation at any moment, and the consequences could be unpredictable. One morning, as David sat in his office, preparing for yet another day, his phone suddenly rang. The call came from an unknown number. Normally he wouldn't answer such calls, but something this time made him pick up. As soon as David said hello, a deep, low voice came through the line. The stranger didn't introduce himself, but got straight to the point. "I know about your schemes," the cold voice said. "And if you don't want everyone to find out, you're going to have to pay. A large amount, and quickly." David's breath caught. He immediately tensed, feeling a chill run down his spine. This voice, this person, he wasn't the type to be joking. The stranger spoke confidently, as if he knew all the details about David's life, his schemes, and the financial holes he had been so carefully hiding. David's mind began to race, his heart pounding faster. Who could this be? How had this person discovered the truth? "You're mistaken," David tried to defend himself, his voice faltering. "I don't know what you're talking about." "You know exactly what I'm talking about, David. You've deceived everyone around you, your family, your investors, your friends. You have 1 week to get the money together. If you don't pay, I'll tell everyone. You'll lose everything. The choice is yours," the stranger concluded, and the line abruptly cut off. David sat there, holding the phone in his hand, stunned. His mind raced through the darkest scenarios. Who could be behind this call? He knew his secrets were well guarded, and only a small circle of trusted people knew about his financial manipulations, but none of them would make such a move. Perhaps it was one of his competitors, who had recently taken too much interest in his company. Or maybe it was one of his former friends, who had long suspected that his success wasn't as clean as he claimed. As he mentally reviewed all the possibilities, David struggled to find an explanation. He couldn't understand how anyone had uncovered his schemes. But something gnawed at him. He had always been cautious. There were no traces in his financial dealings that could directly link him to his crimes. Someone must have conducted a detailed investigation to uncover it all. But who? He couldn't shake the feeling that this person knew too much and spoke too specifically about his affairs. David was convinced that whoever it was, they weren't just trying to scare him. The stranger really knew the truth and was ready to destroy his life. But in reality, things were far more complicated and dangerous than David could have ever imagined. What David couldn't even fathom was much closer than he thought. Michael, his own son, having discovered the suspicious financial dealings, hadn't immediately confronted his father. Instead, he decided to launch his own investigation. Lacking full confidence in his father's dishonesty, Michael hired a private investigator to find out the whole truth. Michael, like David, couldn't believe that the man who had always preached honesty and high moral standards could be involved in such schemes. But the deeper he dug, the clearer the truth became. And then Michael made an unexpected move. He decided to test his father. He asked the investigator to play the role of the blackmailer to see how far David would go to hide his crimes. This wasn't just an investigation. It was a moral test designed to reveal David's true nature. When Michael received the report from the investigator, stating that David had agreed to meet and was prepared to pay for silence, something inside him broke. He realized that his father was willing to sacrifice all moral principles just to preserve his reputation. David now faced the hardest choice of his life. It seemed to him that he was at a dead end, where any step could be fatal. On one hand, he could try to buy his silence one more time, paying the blackmailer the demanded sum, as he was used to doing, always playing on the edge of what was acceptable. But his instincts told him that even if he paid, it wouldn't solve the problem. He was already standing on the brink of disaster, and any mistake could lead to catastrophe. Each day, the situation became more unbearable. David understood that his double life could no longer continue. His lies weren't just about financial schemes. They were a betrayal of his family, who had so blindly believed in him. In one moment, he realized that far more than money and reputation was at stake. He could lose the trust of his wife, Caroline, and his children. And even worse, he could destroy their lives. This fear began to tear him apart from the inside. At night, he couldn't sleep, constantly replaying the possible outcomes in his mind. If he confessed everything, perhaps his family would never forgive him. If he continued lying, this whole structure of deceit upon which his life was built would eventually collapse under its own weight. David was at the crossroads, unsure of which path to take. But what shocked him most was that the fear of losing his family's trust was stronger than the fear of losing everything else. The money, the success, the status, all of it suddenly seemed insignificant compared to the possibility of being unwanted and betrayed in the eyes of his family. David began to understand that the years spent chasing wealth and power had robbed him of the most important thing: sincere relationships with the people closest to him. When Michael finally decided to meet with his father to reveal the truth, David was already on the verge of a nervous breakdown. He didn't know what to expect, but he felt that this meeting with his son would be a turning point. Deep down, David still hoped that he could somehow wriggle out, find an excuse for his actions, but with each passing day, that hope was fading. Michael, cold and determined, came to the meeting with the firm intention of finally laying all the cards on the table. He was the one who had discovered his father's schemes, and the one who had orchestrated the entire blackmail scenario to see just how far David would go with his lies. When Michael sat down across from his father, his face showed a mixture of disappointment and anger. "Dad," Michael began, "I know everything. You've been lying to us for years. You've destroyed what we thought was real. I hired a detective to find out how far you'd go for money, and you went through with it. You didn't stop. You went even further. Did you really think you could buy someone's silence?" David sat across from his son, completely disarmed. All of his attempts to find excuses or explanations were shattered against the wall of harsh reality. He realized that his own son was the one who had uncovered all of his secrets. This moment became his deepest humiliation, because Michael hadn't just discovered the truth. He had intentionally set a trap to reveal his father's true face. David tried to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. His usual confidence was gone, leaving only a sense of emptiness and defeat. Everything he had built over the years, all the efforts he had made to create the perfect image of a successful man, had crumbled in an instant. Michael continued, "I wanted to believe that you could stop, that you'd have the courage to confess. But you chose money, like you always do. Now you have to tell the truth to Mom and Sarah. You need to confess everything. This isn't up for discussion." David nodded silently, knowing that his world had finally collapsed. He could no longer resist. He knew it was over, and from now on his life would never be the same. David had postponed this moment for a long time, but there was no turning back now. That evening, as his entire family gathered in the living room of their luxurious home, he stood before them, feeling as if every word he was about to say would cut deep. The house, which had once seemed like an impregnable fortress, now felt like a mere set, beautiful on the outside, but broken within. Sitting in front of him, his wife Caroline, son Michael, and daughter Sarah waited to hear what he had to say. They suspected nothing, but the tension in the air was palpable. David took a deep breath. He knew he couldn't delay any longer. There was no chance of keeping everything as it was. The truth had come out, and hiding it was pointless. Now, all that remained was to confess everything, no matter how painful it might be. "I have something to tell you," David began, his voice betraying a slight tremor. "This isn't easy, but I can't keep living a lie." Caroline looked intently at her husband, her eyes narrowing slightly, but like the children, she said nothing, waiting for him to continue. David pressed on. "Everything you knew about my business, about how I achieved success." He paused for a moment, gathering his strength. "It was a lie. All of it was a lie." Caroline's eyebrows raised slightly in disbelief. "I've been involved in financial fraud. I've taken out massive loans, hidden my debts, falsified documents to maintain the illusion of success. Right now, our company is on the brink of collapse. I was sure I could handle it, that I'd find a way out, but everything just kept getting worse. Everything we have. It's a lie, just like my wealth." A heavy silence fell over the room. It seemed as though time had slowed down. The reactions came immediately, but each expressed their feelings differently. Caroline was the first whose face revealed the depth of her shock. Her long-held confidence in her husband began to crumble like a house of cards. All her life she had believed in his integrity, proudly flaunting him to her friends, always considering him the epitome of honesty and respectability. Now, all of that vanished in an instant. She looked at him with wide eyes, as if seeing him for the first time. Tears slowly welled in her eyes, but she didn't cry, only silently glancing between her husband and their children, trying to find even a shred of reality she could cling to. "How? How could you?" she whispered, her voice full of pain. All these years you lied to me, lied to us. You've destroyed our lives." Her words were full of disappointment and bitterness. David realized that he hadn't just betrayed her trust, but also their shared history, their love. This betrayal was tearing her apart from the inside. Michael, sitting next to his mother, didn't try to hide his rage. He had long suspected something was wrong, but to face such a revelation was a blow, even after his investigation. He looked at his father with contempt, not bothering to conceal it. Michael had always respected his father, tried to follow his example, but now he sat across from a man who had shattered all of his illusions. Michael clenched his fists, trying to contain his emotions. "You knew," Michael said coldly. "You knew you were deceiving us, and you kept going. Did you think you'd get away with it?" His voice shook with barely contained anger. For Michael, his father's betrayal wasn't just a breach of trust. It was the destruction of the values he had been taught to believe in all his life.